Rejection is not the end of the campaign. It is the first real piece of intelligence you've received. Before the rejection, you were operating on assumption, on the hopeful projection that the world would receive what you had to offer with the warmth and the recognition you privately believed it deserved. The pitch had not yet met reality. The proposal had not yet encountered the actual conditions of the terrain you were moving through. The relationship had not yet been tested by genuine pressure. You were moving forward with the intelligence of someone who has studied the map but not yet walked the ground. The rejection gives you the ground. It tells you something real about the territory, something that no amount of preparation, research, or optimistic forecasting could have provided with the same clarity. It tells you where the resistance actually lives, what the actual objections are, where the gap between your offering and the world's current appetite is located. It is, in the most precise military sense, reconnaissance information gathered under fire, at cost, with an accuracy that comfortable strategic planning from a distance can never achieve. Most people experience rejection as a verdict, a final judgment delivered by an authority whose assessment closes the question of what you are worth and what you are capable of. They absorb the no as a definitive statement about the yes, as proof that the yes was never available, that the attempt was misconceived, that the person or the institution delivering the rejection has seen something true and important that the rejected person failed to see about themselves. Sun Tzu would look at this response with something close to strategic horror. Not because rejection isn't painful, it is, genuinely and unavoidably, but because the transformation of intelligence into verdict is one of the most expensive strategic errors available. You have paid the cost of the information. You have walked into the territory, made contact with its actual conditions, and received a precise, honest report from the front line of your own campaign. And then, instead of using the report, you have allowed the emotional force of its delivery to convert it from data into defeat. The intelligent person does not do this, and Sun Tzu understood exactly why. Let's begin with what rejection is actually telling you, because buried in every no, if you can maintain enough composure to read it rather than simply feel it, is a body of intelligence that the people who accepted you could never provide. The person who accepts you, who says yes to your idea, your application, your proposal, your overture, tells you that you have met their current threshold. Useful information, certainly. Encouraging, certainly, but limited. The yes tells you that the conditions were favorable, that you arrived at the right moment, that the fit was sufficient. It does not tell you where you were weak. It does not tell you which elements of your offering were genuinely compelling and which were simply good enough given the circumstances. It does not stress test what you have built. It confirms it gently, reassuringly, without the kind of friction that reveals where the structure is actually solid and where it only appears to be. The no gives you the stress test. The rejection that specifies, that tells you the idea lacks evidence, the proposal is missing a component, the timing is wrong, the approach doesn't fit the context. This rejection is a gift so precisely calibrated to your improvement that it would be extraordinary to encounter it from any source other than someone who has directly assessed what you brought and found it insufficient. You cannot buy this feedback. You cannot generate it through internal review. You can only receive it from the world at the moment of genuine encounter with its actual conditions, and only if you are composed enough to hear what is being said rather than only feeling the manner of its delivery. And even the rejection that does not specify the flat no without explanation, the silence that functions as refusal, the door that closes without comment, this carries information too. It tells you that the communication of your value has not been sufficient to produce the engagement that an explanation would require. That the initial impression did not generate the investment of curiosity that would lead to specific feedback. That something in the approach needs to change before the content can even be heard. Sun Tzu wrote about the importance of knowing the terrain before committing to engagement. He was explicit that the general who fights on ground they do not understand is gambling, offering their forces to the mercy of conditions they cannot predict or control. The intelligence gathered before engagement was, in his estimation, worth more than any particular tactical brilliance displayed during it. Know the ground, know the enemy, know the weather and the supply lines, and the psychological state of your own forces before the battle begins. But he was equally explicit about something less comfortable, that no pre-battle intelligence is as accurate as the intelligence gathered during the battle itself. The map is never as honest as the terrain. The assessment of the opposition made from a distance is always less precise than the assessment made from direct contact. The plan that seemed comprehensive before engagement will always require revision in the light of what the engagement reveals. Rejection is that revision. It is the moment when the map meets the terrain and the discrepancy becomes visible. And the response to that discrepancy determines everything that follows, whether you revise the map and continue the campaign with better intelligence, or whether you decide that the discrepancy between the map and the terrain is proof that the destination doesn't exist. The destination exists. The map needed updating. This is what has always happened in every campaign worth running, and the people who eventually arrive at the destination they set out for are virtually never the people whose first map was accurate. They are the people who revise their map willingly, use the discrepancy as data rather than as defeat, and continued moving with the improved intelligence that the encounter with real terrain always provides. There is a specific psychological mechanism by which rejection becomes advantage, one that most people never access because they retreat from the rejection's emotional force before the mechanism can operate. It is the mechanism of comparative positioning. Every rejection places you, relative to the person or institution delivering it, in a specific relationship to their current standards, their current needs, their current capacity for recognition. And that relationship, however unfavorable it appears in the moment, is a piece of information that can be actively used to refine your positioning, your timing, or your approach in ways that improve your strategic situation for every subsequent engagement. The actor who is rejected from a role and discovers, in the rejection, that the casting director wanted something raw, less technically polished, more emotionally unguarded, has learned something about the gap between their current offering and the market's current appetite that no successful audition could have revealed. The successful audition confirms the match. The failed one specifies the mismatch, and specifying the mismatch is the beginning of addressing it. The entrepreneur who pitches investors and receives a no based on market timing has learned which dimension of their case was weakest. Not the idea, not the team, not the execution plan, but the macro timing argument. The next pitch can be built around a stronger answer to that specific objection. The rejection has done the work of identifying the weakest link. Every subsequent version of the pitch is stronger for having met that resistance. Sun Tzu wrote that every battle teaches you something you did not know before the battle began. The general who learns nothing from a lost engagement has not simply suffered a defeat, they have suffered a defeat and then refused the intelligence the defeat was trying to deliver. The general who learns everything the lost engagement has to teach is already, before the next engagement begins, better positioned than they were before the last one. The capacity to learn from the lost engagement, from the rejected proposal, the closed door, the relationship that did not work, the position that was not offered, is the capacity that separates the people who eventually arrive from the people who stay where the first rejection left them. Let's examine what the psychological advantage of rejection actually looks like in practice, because the transformation from wound to weapon is not automatic, and the conditions that make it possible are worth examining precisely. The first condition is what Sun Tzu called strategic composure, the ability to assess the situation accurately immediately after the engagement, rather than being swept entirely into the emotional current of the loss. Strategic composure is not the performance of being fine. It is the discipline of giving the grief its necessary space and simultaneously refusing to let the grief be the only lens through which the event is processed. The grief is real. Rejection hurts romantically, professionally, creatively, personally, in ways that are not reducible to strategic miscalculation, and should not be treated as if they are. The person who has been rejected by someone they loved, or passed over for a position they had worked years to earn, or seen a creative work they poured themselves into, dismissed without serious engagement. This person is experiencing something genuine, and the requirement to extract intelligence from the experience is not a requirement to skip the experience itself. But the grief and the intelligence gathering are not mutually exclusive. The most strategically composed people do not choose between feeling the rejection and learning from it. They do both, in sequence or even simultaneously, allowing the emotional reality its full weight, while also, somewhere in the part of their mind that is always watching, maintaining the orientation of someone who will eventually need to move again, and who therefore cannot afford to let the current position be the final one. The second condition is the practice of honest autopsy, not the comforting revisionism that protects the ego, the version of events where the rejection was entirely unjust, entirely the assessor's failure, entirely a reflection of their limitations rather than any gap in your offering. That version may be partially true, but it is almost never entirely true, and using it as the complete account forecloses the learning that the honest account would have provided. The honest autopsy asks, what did I actually bring to this encounter, and where was it genuinely insufficient? Not where was it misunderstood, not where did the assessor fail to see its value, but where was the gap real? Where did the rejection identify something that a different version of the offering, more fully developed, more precisely calibrated to the actual conditions of the terrain, would not have left open? This question is uncomfortable. It requires the willingness to sit with the possibility that the rejection was at least partially right, that something needed to change. And that willingness is precisely what most people, in the emotional aftermath of rejection, are least equipped to access. Which is why the people who access it are, systematically and over time, the people who improve most rapidly and arrive furthest. There is a specific advantage that rejection provides that has nothing to do with the intelligence it delivers about your offering and everything to do with what it reveals about you. Rejection is a test of your relationship to failure, and your relationship to failure is, arguably, the single most important variable in determining the trajectory of anything you attempt over time. The person who is destroyed by rejection, who withdraws from subsequent attempts, who recalibrates their ambitions downward in response to the no, who allows the emotional force of the closed door to permanently narrow their sense of what is possible for them. This person has revealed something important. Their progress is bounded by their pain tolerance. They will only go as far as they can go without encountering the specific discomfort that rejection produces. And the specific discomfort that rejection produces is encountered almost immediately in any endeavor worth pursuing, because the world's initial response to anything genuinely new or genuinely ambitious is almost always some form of no. The person who processes rejection as information and continues, who brings the revised map back to the terrain with the patient, unsentimental persistence of someone who has decided the destination is real, regardless of what the current weather is doing, this person has revealed something equally important. Their progress is not bounded by their pain tolerance. It is bounded only by the actual, genuine, ultimate limits of what is achievable, which are almost always further than the first rejection suggested. Sun Tzu wrote that the victorious general does not seek battle, but the general who is forced to battle finds victory. What he meant is that the person who has so thoroughly prepared, so accurately assessed the terrain, so strategically positioned themselves in advance of engagement, that the outcome is determined before the fighting begins. This person does not need to rely on the inspiration of the moment or the courage of the desperate. They have already done the work that makes the outcome likely. Every rejection, honestly processed and genuinely learned from, is part of that preparation. It is the terrain teaching you what the maps could not, and the person who receives those lessons willingly, who goes back after every encounter with more accurate intelligence and a better revised approach, is the person who is doing, in the only way it can actually be done, the work that eventual success requires. Let's ground this in a story because Sun Tzu's principles have a way of remaining abstract until they are seen in the life of a specific person under specific pressure, making specific choices. James Dyson, before the vacuum cleaner that made him a billionaire, produced 5,126 failed prototypes, not versions that were close, not iterations that almost worked. Failed prototypes, designs that were tested against the actual conditions of the real world and found insufficient for the purpose they were built for. Each one a rejection of the current design by the only assessor whose verdict actually matters, the reality of how things work. Dyson has spoken extensively about his relationship to this process, and what he describes is not the heroic endurance of someone gritting their teeth through pain in pursuit of an outcome they believe in. It is the genuine, almost scientific curiosity of someone who found each failure genuinely interesting, who asked, after each one, not, "Why did this happen to me?" but "What is this telling me about the actual problem I am trying to solve?" Each failure revised the map. Each rejection from reality delivered intelligence that the previous version of the design could not have provided. The 5,127th iteration, the one that worked, was not a triumph over the failures. It was the direct product of them. It was the design that could only have been arrived at by a person who had received and genuinely processed the specific intelligence that each of the 5,126 failures had delivered. The failures were not the obstacles to the success. The failures were the path to the success. And the distinction between those two framings, between rejection as obstacle and rejection as intelligence, is the distinction between the person who stops after the first few and the person who arrives at 5,000 and then continues. Now let's talk about the dimension of rejection that is most painful and most rarely addressed. Honestly, the rejection that carries no actionable intelligence, because it is not about what you brought, but about who you are. The romantic rejection, the social exclusion, the friendship that ended without explanation, the group that closed its circle before you reached it. These rejections are different in kind from the professional or creative ones. They feel different, wound differently, and resist the intelligence extraction framing more powerfully than any other, because the honest autopsy of a personal rejection seems to require an honest assessment of your own person rather than your offering. And assessing your own person with the same cool, analytical distance you might bring to a failed business pitch is not something most human beings can do without the assessment becoming either self-punishment or self-protective denial. Sun Tzu's wisdom here requires the most careful application because the terrain of personal rejection is genuinely different from professional terrain, and the same tactical framework cannot simply be transplanted without modification. What can be salvaged from the Sun Tzu framework is this: the distinction between what is yours to address and what is not. Some personal rejections carry genuine intelligence information about how you show up in close relationships, about patterns in your behavior that consistently produce distance rather than connection, about the gap between how you intend to be received and how you are actually received. This intelligence is worth the discomfort of honestly processing, not as self-punishment, but as the same honest autopsy that a professional rejection warrants. But some personal rejections are simply the operation of a fit that does not exist. The simple, impersonal fact that not every person resonates with every other person, that not every social circle is compatible with every individual's genuine nature, that the absence of fit is not a verdict on the fitness of either party. These rejections require not intelligence extraction, but something more like release the recognition that the terrain you encountered was not your terrain, and that the campaign is better continued elsewhere than pursued on ground that was never going to favor you. The discernment between these two, the rejection that carries genuine intelligence about your own patterns, and the rejection that simply confirms a mismatch that you cannot and should not try to address, is one of the most sophisticated judgments available, and it is arrived at slowly, with the help of honest people who know you well enough to offer their actual assessment, rather than their protective one. Here is the most important thing Sun Tzu would want you to understand about rejection, and it is the insight that converts everything else from theory into lived strategic advantage. The campaign is not the encounter. The encounter is one point in the campaign, and the campaign is defined not by any single encounter, but by the quality of the relationship between the person running it and the intelligence being gathered across the full arc of the effort. The general who treats each battle as the campaign, who stakes everything on each engagement, who has no reserves, no alternative approach, no willingness to absorb a loss and continue, is the general who is most vulnerable to defeat. Because defeat, for this general, is not a battle lost. It is the campaign ended. And ending the campaign after one lost battle, in territory as vast and as varied as the one you are moving through, is almost always premature. The general who understands that the campaign is larger than any single engagement, who has absorbed losses before and continued, who has revised the map before and found better ground, who knows from experience that the terrain that was impassable from one approach often yields from another. This general cannot be defeated by a single rejection, however significant. They can only be slowed. And being slowed, for someone who was going to keep moving anyway, is not defeat. It is simply the terrain. Every rejection you have experienced, every no you have received, every door that has been closed, every encounter where what you brought met resistance rather than welcome, has been preparing you for the encounter that is still coming. Not by toughening you against feeling, by giving you the intelligence you need to be genuinely ready when the terrain finally opens, when the approach that incorporates everything you have learned from every previous engagement meets the conditions that we're waiting for. Exactly that version of you. The campaign continues, the intelligence compounds, and the person still moving, still revising, still learning, still bringing the next version of the offering to the next version of the terrain, is the person who eventually arrives at the place where the yes was always waiting. So here is how you hold rejection from this day forward. When it arrives, and it will arrive, as long as you are attempting anything genuinely worth attempting, you allow it its full emotional reality. You do not rush through the pain toward the lesson. You feel what is real, you give the grief the space it actually requires, and you do not perform a resilience you haven't yet genuinely developed. And then, when the acute force of the emotional impact has passed, not before, because before is not the time for honest assessment, you turn to what the rejection has given you, the intelligence, the specification of the gap, the map correction that this encounter with the actual terrain has made available. The honest answer to the question, what do I now know about this terrain that I did not know before I walked into it? And you take that knowledge honestly gathered, genuinely processed, held with neither the distortion of ego protection nor the distortion of unnecessary self-punishment, and you use it, not as the final accounting of what you are worth, but as the most accurate intelligence currently available about where the gap between what you brought and what the terrain required actually lives. And then you close the gap, or you find different terrain, or you revise the approach until it fits the terrain you have, but you continue with better intelligence, a more accurate map, and the particular kind of quiet confidence that belongs only to the person who has been through this before, who knows from direct experience that rejection is not the end of the campaign. It is the point in the campaign where the real preparation finally begins.